In 1967, a Swedish truck arrived in Britain. It was faster, more powerful, and more comfortable than anything British factories had ever built. Within a decade, the industry that had owned the roads for a century was finished. This is the story of how one truck destroyed an entire nation's manufacturing heritage. Before 1967, British trucks owned the roads. Companies like Leyland, AEC, Foden, ERF and Atkinson built the lorries that moved Britain. These were reliable workhorses. They were cheap to buy and cheap to run. Drivers called them gaffers' lorries. The term meant honest, no-nonsense trucks that did the job and lasted forever. The standard British articulated truck in the 1960s was simple: a Gardner engine producing 180 horsepower, a 6-speed gearbox, a basic cab with wood frames and alloy panels. The cab was cramped. There was no sleeper bunk. There was no heater, no radio. The steering was heavy. The noise was constant. But British hauliers didn't mind. They knew no different. British truck makers had no pressure to improve. The market was theirs. Competition was domestic. Everyone built trucks the same way because that's how it had always been done. The idea of an overseas manufacturer threatening this was laughable. Then everything changed. On September 30th, 1967, two men announced something that would reshape Britain's industrial future. Jim McKelvey had sold his haulage business. Jim Keedon worked at Pressed Steel in Scotland making car bodies. They looked across Europe and found something: Volvo. They decided to import Swedish trucks into Britain under a company called Ailsa Trucks. The first customer was Thomas Hutchinson, a haulier from Walk-on-Tyne. He ordered an F88. This wasn't a gamble. It was the moment British truck manufacturing started dying. The Volvo F88 had been designed years earlier. The cab design appeared on the Titan tip-top in 1964. But the complete truck came to market in 1965. Volvo called it System 8. It was export-oriented. It was built to conquer global markets. The truck arrived in Britain with specifications that shocked the industry. A 9.6-litre turbocharged diesel engine, not naturally aspirated like Gardner units, turbo. This meant more power from a smaller engine. The F88 produced 260 horsepower in base form. Premium versions reached 318 horsepower. British trucks at 32 tonnes gross had 180 horsepower. The gap was huge. The gearbox was 8-speed or 16-speed, synchromesh. British trucks had crash boxes with 2-speed differentials. Drivers had to know what they were doing. The F88 made it easier, almost foolproof. But the real killer was the cab. Volvo designed a sleeper cab that was revolutionary for long-distance work. All-steel construction, with a bunk compartment behind the driver. Leyland had introduced an all-steel ergomatic cab in 1964, but the British cab wasn't designed for sleeper use. British companies didn't offer the combination that Volvo did. A sleeper cab, with comfort, with power steering, with heating and radio. No British truck had put all these together. Tests by Commercial Motor magazine in 1968 said it felt like driving a car. One test driver wrote that the F88 was magnificent, easy to handle, and that British drivers had never experienced anything like it. Fuel consumption was 6.5 miles per gallon at 32 tonnes. This matched British trucks despite having nearly 100 extra horsepower. The efficiency came from turbocharging. The design was decades ahead of its time. The fact that modern trucks are still built on the same engineering principles as the F88 proves this. The price in 1967 was £3,500. Expensive, but operators quickly did the maths. Better fuel efficiency, faster journey times, driver retention because comfort mattered, higher payloads because the truck could handle the power. London Brick, one of Britain's largest operators, ordered a fleet of F86s and F88s. They replaced their AEC lorries. This was the moment everything shifted. If a company as big as London Brick chose foreign over British, something fundamental had changed. By 1968, the Volvo invasion had begun. Ailsa Trucks started assembling the F86 in Scotland. More F88s arrived. Drivers who tried one bought another. Hauliers who tested them standardized on Volvo. Many firms that initially tried an F86 or 2 stuck with Volvo for all their truck needs. The effect was immediate. British truck makers watched their market crumble. This wasn't slow decline. This was wholesale rejection. Once hauliers experienced the F88, they never looked back. In 1970, Volvo introduced the G88. The front axle was moved 300 millimetres further forward. This change solved a problem. British roads had bridge weight limits. The axle spread had to meet specific regulations, or trucks couldn't legally cross certain structures. This forward axle configuration let the G88 meet UK bridge formula requirements while still operating at the standard 32-tonne limit. In other markets like Sweden or Australia, the same truck could carry 52.5 tonnes, but in Britain, the move was about legal compliance, not payload increase. Other European makers saw the opportunity. Scania had launched the 110 series in the late 1960s. These trucks were also superior to British models. DAF came in. Mercedes began selling in Britain. The foreign invasion that Ailsa trucks started became a wave. By 1970, the writing was clear. British truck makers were outclassed in every metric: power, comfort, reliability, style. The Volvo F88 and its competitors were simply better. Leyland Motors saw the threat. They developed the Marathon in response. It arrived in 1973. It was underfunded. It was late. The cab was a reworked version of the 1965 ergomatic design. British industry had saved money by reusing old tooling. The result was inferior to what Volvo had offered 7 years earlier. The Marathon had problems: below-par heating, ventilation issues, pronounced cab roll on corners. Leyland fixed these in the Marathon 2 in 1977, but by then, the market had moved on. Few Marathons sold before production ended in 1979. AEC faced the same problem. Its V8 engine was a failure. The 800 series was unreliable. Project FPT-70 was supposed to create a world-class heavy haulage tractor. Costs spiraled. It never happened. AEC would eventually disappear. The 1970s was the decade that decided Britain's truck industry. The motorway network was expanding. Journeys were getting faster. Drivers wanted comfort for long hours in the cab. Power became essential. The old British model of cheap and basic was dead. Foden had been building trucks since the 1800s. It survived the steam era. It pioneered diesel, but it couldn't compete with Volvo. In 1980, American company PACCAR acquired Foden. Independent British production continued briefly. By 2006, the last Foden rolled off the line in July. 150 years of continuous truck manufacturing finished. ERF was established in 1933 by Edwin Richard Foden and others who left the original Foden company. It built quality trucks, but ERF never achieved scale. In 1981, domestic sales reached only 1,083 trucks. By 1996, PACCAR acquired ERF through Western Star. In 2000, MAN bought it. The factory in Middlewich closed in 2002. The marque was discontinued in 2007. Atkinson and Scammell disappeared into the British Leyland Empire. They were absorbed and eventually discontinued. Their brands vanished. The trucks that once filled British roads became memories. Leyland itself survived longer than others. This was only because of massive government investment in the 1970s under Michael Edwards. The T45 road train arrived in 1980. It was a proper modern truck, wind tunnel tested, advanced engineering, but it came too late to save British independence. In 1998, PACCAR acquired Leyland. The company that had built British commercial vehicles for decades became an American subsidiary. From that moment, Leyland built DAF trucks for the UK market. DAF itself had been acquired by PACCAR in 1996. The consolidation was complete. By the 2000s, independent British truck manufacturing was extinct. The factories that had employed tens of thousands now built foreign-branded vehicles or closed entirely. The heritage was gone. The expertise was gone. The market was dominated by Volvo, Scania, Mercedes, Iveco and MAN. The Volvo F88 didn't destroy these companies alone, but it was the watershed. It was the moment hauliers realised British wasn't good enough anymore. It was the truck that proved the future belonged to Swedish engineering. Something remarkable happened that proved the F88's genius. Drivers kept them running for decades. Bob Carmichael owned a 1973 F88 near Stratford-on-Avon. He used it to collect felled trees and transport them to sawmills. His F88 worked continuously until 2023. 50 years of daily commercial work. Not preserved, not pampered, working, making money. It was one of the oldest F88s still operating commercially in Britain. While other 1970s F88s remain in seasonal agricultural use, Carmichael's was remarkable for continuous daily operation across decades. A Portuguese F88 sold new in 1973 worked in the Algarve hauling fruit until 2014, 41 years of work. It still had a valid MOT when it was discovered. The owner had updated it over the years. The original job just kept getting done. These weren't exceptions. The F88 was built to last. Many examples from the 1970s are still in use today on preserved heritage fleets and at shows. Collectors seek them out. Good examples are worth substantial money. This durability proves something. The F88 wasn't a flash in the pan. It was a fundamental shift in engineering quality. Drivers understood this. They trusted these trucks. They kept them long after the warranty ended. British trucks were reliable, but the F88 was reliable and advanced. That combination was unstoppable. The tragedy was that British engineers could have innovated. They had the knowledge. What they didn't have was the investment. What they didn't have was corporate will. What they didn't have was understanding that the world had changed. The 1960s world, where cheap and basic was enough, had gone. Modern motorways demanded power. International trade demanded comfort. Long-distance haulage demanded durability. The F88 delivered all three. British manufacturers delivered none. If you had walked into a Leyland factory in 1967 and told the engineers what was coming, they would have laughed. British trucks had dominated for a century. One Swedish truck couldn't change that, but it did. The engineers at Leyland and AEC were skilled. British industry had pioneered diesel engines. Leyland had the TL12 engine. It was excellent, one of the best engines ever made. But it had no pedigree overseas. Marketing matters. The AECV8 should have been a world-class engine. Instead it was a failure. Costs spiralled. Engineering problems mounted. The project collapsed. By the time solutions were found, competitors had moved on. The F88 was the truck that proved this. Every haulier who drove one understood. This was the direction the industry was going. This was what drivers wanted. This was what profit margins demanded. The tragedy wasn't the F88. The tragedy was that British industry had the expertise to build something similar, but they didn't. They were too comfortable, too confident, too slow to react. By the time they reacted, Volvo owned the market. By the time they invested properly, foreign manufacturers had already won. By the time they understood what had happened, the British truck industry was finished. The F88 didn't destroy British haulage. It was the moment the industry understood it had already been destroyed by its own complacency. The truck didn't steal the future. It arrived from the future. British manufacturers just weren't there to greet it.